Today, I'm joined by Godward. She is a mom, a school based therapist, an educational consultant, and an anonymous ish Twitter poster. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is so great.
I'm really glad to have you on. And I've been following you for quite a while, probably fairly close to when I started uh, existing on Twitter as a separate entity. And it was, yeah, I mean, you have a lot of very interesting and on the ground informative insights about a few subjects that I'm personally very interested in. One, motherhood. Two, rediscovering, discovering faith and kind of, going Godward. And three, and maybe now slowly more acutely important for me, the touchy subject of education. So I think all these three areas are things that I'd love to explore with you. And yeah, I'm glad that you're here.
Hopefully, this will be a productive conversation. I hope that I can offer something to you and your audience that would be useful.
You absolutely can. I mean, you're definitely someone who's had, experience not only raising children, but also with other people's children, and especially in situations where things were not going 100% right. And I feel like, that's very specific and important experience nowadays, especially because I feel like, a lot of very subtle things are going wrong. And I feel like a lot of people don't really have their finger on the pulse because, when you deal with your own child, maybe one or two children, that's pretty much as people are having now, if not zero. You kind of have a case study of one or two and you see kind of what the problems are there. But for you, I mean, you've been doing this for a while as well. I mean, what are some kind of more broad trends that you've seen coming in and things that might not necessarily be good trends, or maybe also good trends? I mean, if you've seen something that's good, so typically on this show we notice the bad, but obviously if there's some heartening trends, I'd love to hear about them. But how have things changed, let's say, in the last maybe 5 or 10 years and what you've seen?
Well, I would like to first just make a quick distinction. I kind of started this being in the education therapy world quite a few years ago, about a decade ago. And at that time, I was in a very rural setting in a southern state. So the needs and the problems were very different than where I work now in an urban setting, which is what I've been doing for about 5 years in an urban setting in the northern part of the United States. So it's just a very different dynamic, different needs, different issues, and so I couldn't speak to things in a way that would be, I guess, similar because they're just very different contexts. But where I am now currently, just some trends that I see are, and even across the span of 10 years, I see a lot more illiteracy. I talk about this on Twitter a lot. I just see so many students who are coming to me, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grades, who are functionally illiterate. A lot of them don't even know. If I said, "What are your vowels?" They wouldn't know what vowels are. If I ask them to list words, like how many words can you write from memory, very few of them can write more than maybe 20 words just off the top of their heads. And so in my experience and in my I want to use the word expertise very loosely, but what I tend to see is when children cannot read, when they're not comprehending the things that are being taught to them, it kind of translates into this really poor behavioral issue. So they're bored, they're frustrated, their self-esteem is low, they're discouraged about themselves or their abilities, they feel stupid, whatever. And that kind of translates into, well, I'm here, this is a waste of my time. I'm here at school, it's a waste of my time. And so I'm going to do something to get attention. I'm going to do something to occupy my boredom, that kind of thing. And so what happens is the failures in the classroom, the failures academically lead to behavior issues. Now, that's not the only thing contributing to the behavior problems, but that's one thing. But I do see, talking about behavior issues, I do see a huge trend toward just, I hate using this term, but I just can't think of another term to use, just really barbaric behavior. So many fights all the time, constant threats of fights, threats of violence. Recently, there was something involving weapons at my school, um, gang-related activities. Teachers will be people will use profanity against, like, the students will use profanity, curse out their teachers, throw things, destroy classrooms. It's a much more dangerous environment than what I saw even 5 years ago in a classroom. So, like, just even in the last 5 years, I see a major just gravitation toward violent, barbaric behaviors, and, um, kind of what I see with students is they're entertained by this. It's kind of they have nothing else to enrich their lives. They have nothing else going on, so they just beef with one another. They stage these fights, people video the fights, then the videos circulate, and it's just this big kind of entertainment ring. Um, and I mentioned this in another podcast that I did, just a complete obsession with the profane. Everything they listen to, everything they read, everything they're exposing themselves to is profane. It's dark, it's violent. There's nothing beautiful being poured into their lives. There's no beautiful words, no beautiful music, no beautiful art, literature, nothing. Everything is just dark and ugly. And those are, I wish I had something really positive to say, but unfortunately, I think we're kind of in this really dark place with education and all the behaviors that are um, that are happening, particularly in the schools. And I've mentioned before, also on Twitter, that social media plays a huge part in these types of cultures, like these kind of violent, barbaric cultures, because everything is kind of starting online. They start, somebody will post a video here, and then they'll watch that, and then they'll get their friends, "Hey, did you see what this person posted? And they're gonna fight me tomorrow at 3 o'clock." And it's just constant. It is constant. So those are the trends I see, much more violent, behaviors, complete disregard for any kind of authority, and that's kind of the collective, that's kind of the bird's eye view of everything. Now, I meet with children individually, and when I meet with them one-on-one, they're people. They're children, and they have hopes and dreams of their own, or they're trying to develop those hopes and dreams. They have wounds, they have hurts, they have personalities. They like, pizza, or they like cheeseburgers, or, whatever. I mean, they're like real people. Then they kind of get thrown into this whole big mess of other things going on, and they kind of just get meshed into this really violent, barbaric culture. But they are individuals still. I don't know if that answers your question. Hopefully it does a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's sadly pretty much the direction I expected things to have gone in. I mean, I live very far away. I mean, some of the dynamics that apply in the U.S. Apply here less, just because I guess a little ethnic strife we don't necessarily have in the same way here. But there is one phenomenon. Obviously, social media is huge here, and very funnily enough, I'm now taking my toddler to a little kind of like play group educational thing, just so I can meet. To be honest, meet other moms and make play dates and stuff
Right.
like that because
Mhm.
he's too young for kindergarten yet.
Right.
So and we had kind of this intro session with some guy who essentially, I guess he owns the kind of baby school there, and he was just saying, you won't believe, because of all the technology these children are exposed to, what their processing speed is. You can't even imagine the processing speed. And I was like, this is a toddler group. I mean, what exactly, how much technology do you expect these children to be, subjected to? But here it's all like, if you don't give them the technology, which is essentially leaving them with an iPad or whatever educational programming, you're essentially, people are a bit suspicious of that because you're kind of retarding your children's ability to
Mm.
engage with the technology. And I'm like, I don't know. I'd rather retard his ability to engage with technology than just throw him to the wolves, because I see what this thing does to me. And I can't say. I mean, you watch some Miss Rachel and occasional Cocomelon if there's an emergency,
Right,
but
right.
it's not like just the standard. Even here is like multiple hours a day. Whenever I have something to do, you just plop him there, and he it is mesmerizing. So they're essentially captivated. They're frozen by it. So it's really
Mhm,
practical,
mhm.
especially if you have a very wiggly toddler. just install him in front of whatever tickled his fancy. So it is a bit of a worrying trend here, especially because a lot of this stuff is kind of peer pressure type situation. It's like the idea that, oh, you I want to have a free range kid. Okay, but if the police arrests you for letting your kid, walk to school, or there's no other kids doing anything at the park and everyone's at home on their devices and things like that, it's very hard to do it on your own. You really kind of need to find your people, and have people whose values align with you. And the values of the people are starting to go into a direction that, even here, like, this is like a backwater. um they're not they're not good. I mean, they're not. I don't know. I don't see this going in a good direction. Yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
it's super
Yeah,
worrying.
yeah, that's fair. I'm glad that you said that because that's something that I talk about with just kind of some of my therapist teacher peers. Um, there is no value system with these kids that I work with. I mean, it's a lot of posturing for power. There's always this power struggle, and a lot of kids will want to align themselves with someone they see as powerful, and then that's kind of how gang activity and stuff starts. Um, but what I really long to see, and this is something I've really tried to focus a lot of my work on, is bringing parents in and just kind of, I guess, I don't wanna say teach, but just empowering them or trying to touch something inside them that ignites that love for their child. Like, I want parents to love their children, and I see so many kids who really have a lack of love. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. It's just they've not been loved well by the people who were supposed to love them well. And the people who are supposed to attune to them, see what their needs are, and love them have failed to do that. And it's I'm not disparaging the parents because those parents have had their own struggles and maybe had parents that were not good parents themselves. So they've just kind of repeated what was modeled. But what I long to see is parents who were kind of brought in, if either with the school or I don't know what community organization would do this, but to kind of engage parents more. I would love to see more parenting clinics, parenting seminars, things like that, where you're just kind of engaging parents to think about, like maybe do a whole session on attachment theory or something like that. Just a lot of things that parents maybe don't know that they should be forming these proper attachments, these secure attachments with their children, what it looks like to love their children, not in a condescending way or a this is what you need to be doing with your kid kind of way, not in a reprimanding kind of way, but in a way that they were like, "Oh, yeah, I love my kids. I want to provide the best that I can for them. I want to show them support and that kind of thing." So, values do trickle down, and when children don't have parents who have values or their values are, you know, poor values. I don't wanna disparage people, but when children don't see any example set, I mean, they have nothing, and they're just kind of, like, raising themselves, and then whenever, like, a kid in the school kind of raises up as a leader, they kind of gravitate toward those few people, that 1 or 2 people who are kind of leaders because they're looking for a parent, and this older student is kind of providing some parenting. They're showing them love or showing them, you know, support or whatever, and that that's kind of a trend I see, but going back to what you were talking about with the values, there isn't this trickle down of really virtuous value, principle making existing. That's a terrible way of wording it, but
Yeah.
that's not trickling down, and kids are reflecting that.
Yeah, it does seem like a kind of generalized, like Lord of the Flies type situation that we've ended up
Mhm.
putting our kids in, because you're essentially describing them making their own little societies from scratch and just having, politics of the prison yard type interactions with each other. And it's not surprising that it turns into a prison yard type environment, which is what you're describing, like actual violence, gang formation, little turf wars, probably, at the level of whatever grade they're in, but, it's still, children can be very violent. So yeah, I think this, there's a lot of confusion about values because I was thinking about, back in the day when, typically we used to live in smaller communities and the parents of the other children would know contextually who your parents were and you would know how they rank in the society and you would have all of these little points of leverage and understanding about what your role in society was. I mean, even if it was like lower down the ladder, but you kind of knew what was going on. But now parents all work for these, maybe mysterious corporations or jobs that have nothing to do with the other kids at the school, and they have value systems that are very foreign, maybe to the other kids at school, like different ethnic backgrounds, different religions, different media consumption, 'cause that seems to be the foundation of culture nowadays. Like, your parents watch different shows to to Kenny's parents, and you barely can speak the same language. So I think it's, this kind of Tower of Babel has had foreseeable consequences. I mean, the children sense this uncertainty and they latch on to whatever's there, and a lot of times what's there is all sorts of strange things that are modeled by social media. And yeah, like you said, the most, I don't know, ballsy kids in the schoolyard.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's and because you made that distinction, there used to be smaller communities. That's kind of the difference in like a rural setting and an urban setting. Even though urban setting, everybody's kind of close together, there's something about a rural setting. Everybody kind of went to church together. Even though they were more spread out, they were tighter knit. It's very strange. You would think in an urban setting with everybody being close together that they would be close knit. It's actually, in my experience working in rural settings and urban settings, it's actually very different. The urban settings are more fractured and almost have rivals in a way. And in the rural communities, everybody just kind of helps out and depends on one another, and everybody kind of knows everybody. But in the city, I have noticed these people stay here, these people stay here, never the two shall mix kind of thing. So it's really interesting. I think that that's a good observation about how communities used to be different.
Yeah, I mean, just living closely together doesn't really make a community. I mean, that was kind of my experience, just living in the big city as well. I mean, the city itself is essentially kind of a dwelling place for its workers. Like that's kind of how it presents itself. And if you really try and if you multiple times go and bring the cookies to your neighbors and, start a WhatsApp group and really are the like hub, or, you can kind of make some semblance of a community, but usually there's nothing like organic to plug into. You kind of have to be the architect of whatever you want to build there. And that's pretty alienating if you're not like, naturally the most socially butterfly-esque type of person. And yeah, most people aren't. So they just plug into everyone else who's super atomized. And yeah, it's just, I don't know exactly what it is about the city. I think it's just the fact that, people really tend to be foreign. The ones that they're not the same as, in a little town where you said you probably have the same religion, same church, people, your parents know them. There's kind of this implicit trust, or at least not even like, I come from a relatively low trust place. And it's not even necessarily that you trust other people, but you have a familiarity with them and you kind of know how to deal with them, even if there's not like this, Scandinavian level social trust. But it's like
Right,
even that's kind of how we deal with, ethnic strife as well. You kind of know, the stereotypes usually kind of fit, but everyone knows their own place. So
right.
it's you have the language, you have the values to negotiate these waters, which you don't really in the city. And I guess that's kind of the scary part. That's kind of the low level tension that I felt as well, that these people are all strangers and not sure if they have good intent or bad intent or what they want from me. And it's just, I don't know, a strange,
That's right.
yeah, strange medium to like to live in. And I guess that's something that these kids probably intuit as well. Like this is an unsafe
Yes.
environment.
All of these kids come from really dangerous parts of the city. Um, so I'm not exaggerating when I say this, if you are going home and you might encounter a stray bullet or your neighbor, your street might get shot up. I mean, when you live like that constantly, your cortisol is just pumping through your veins constantly because you are always in fear of something happening. And I mean, all of my students have access to weapons or know someone who, I mean, it's very easy for them to access that stuff if they wanted to. So, when you just live in that environment where death or violence is just the norm, it changes, like, your brain. It really changes how you think about life. You kind of develop this survivalist mentality, which is what I feel like I see a lot with the fighting and stuff like that. It's just survive, 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 and, that's no way to live.
Yeah,
It's
there's
it's just no way to live.
a school in the UK. I don't know if you've kind of looked at this example. It's kind of, I don't know if you'd call it a charter school, but it's kind of a, I don't know exactly what the status of it is. Called the Michaela School, and
Oh,
they pride,
Michaela. Yeah, mhm.
yeah, they pride themselves on being quite strict, or essentially just having very high standards for their kids. And I think it's more like a charter school because the parents will apply to get into there, but there are no, I think, no application processes. Essentially, just kind of the commitment of the parents to have them there. And a lot of children also from kind of inner city or more deprived regions are doing really well in these schools. And essentially, the thing that they say is the distinguishing factor there is the fact that it's essentially zero tolerance for a lot of the stuff that you're describing. Like, they're putting the hammer down. So I don't know if this is an approach. Do you think this is sensible? Do you think this is scalable? Because I feel like the factor of the parents being involved there is a bit of a tell of the kind of children that make it into the school. So it's a bit of a selection problem, or I don't know, favorable selection for the school. So, what do you think about these approaches of just making the schools stricter?
I mean, I think that sounds great. I think I think it sounds great. Number 1, I think you have to have buy-in from parents. I mean, you really have to have buy-in because when you have I mean, I have a lot of parents who are like, "Not my kid," kind of thing. I mean, they're very much not going to accept strict punishment. But that's probably the biggest thing is parent buy-in. Oh, you froze. Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah, parent buy-in because it sounds like Michaela's school has that. Uh, When I would say the majority of my parents don't care. They just don't care. And they want their child to perform well or to behave well, or they say that they do, but once there's an actual consequence, they fight the consequence tooth and nail. And I think that when you have a public school situation where you're providing by law, you have to provide education to these children, to these families, your hands are a little tied with what you can actually do, what parents will actually tolerate. So, I know Michaela's school, I'm familiar with that. Tom Bennett, I have his book Running the Room. I'm familiar with those, approaches to classroom management, behavior management, those types of things, and I think they're wonderful. But I think it boils down to a lot of parent buy-in and what they will actually support and allow. Um, for me, I look at my kids that I see, and I want to advocate for we're only going to teach reading, for the first half of the year because I see all of my kids getting upset and frustrated and discouraged and acting out because they are just completely bored, frustrated during the day because they cannot read anything that's in front of them. They can't engage because they're so far behind. And we went through the whole COVID thing, and the district that I'm in was they were out of school the longest. They did online learning the longest. So there's an even greater deficit. And so I feel as though if there was a greater emphasis on literacy, on these types of skills, like learning these and learning them well, and then moving in that direction, that would actually temper some of the behaviors. Right now, I just see a bunch of frustrated kids who are bored, and it might curb some behaviors if they were actually able to read. what is in front of them. Um, so parent buy-in, big thing for behavior and those types of strict enforcements. And then on my end, like in an American school, just like actually like high quality education and teaching children the skills, the literacy skills, particularly that they need to excel in the world, or at least have the potential to.
Yeah, and I feel like this, the fact that a lot of children are left behind also kind of puts into question what can be done for the children who might be really capable and at excelling, but it doesn't sound like this is an environment where you can even, have a successful gifted program, can even identify gifted kids because they're probably, scared for their lives of not being the tall poppy in the sea of, gang members. So I'm just thinking about, potentially gifted children in this context that, obviously you don't want to leave children behind. You want to make them functional members of society, but also the kids who might have special potential or the possibility of, just excelling in a field, they might be left behind as well
Mhm,
by this environment.
mhm, mhm. That's correct. Yes. Yes, I
Yeah.
feel like I do feel like my kids who are, maybe you would say more gifted or just more creative or something like that, I do feel like they are kind of all that's kinda has to be repressed because their environment is just so chaotic. It's just so chaotic. And and I also feel for children who are kind of more introverted and who like more quiet, that kind of thing. All day long, they're in an environment that is totally chaotic, fluorescent lights, yelling, throwing stuff, cursing at teachers. It's just so overstimulating for those kids. So I do feel for the kids who might be more gifted and could maybe be at a could pace themselves a little differently than maybe your average, but also feel for the kids who are just kind of introverted, kind of, more withdrawn and just prefer quiet. They don't have that option. There's no option for them to have a quiet lunch away from everyone. There's no option for them to say, "Hey, can I have a 15-minute break just so that I can kind of recharge for a minute?" They kinda have to go all day long in this overstimulating environment, and that wears on them. It's not for their personalities, it's just not conducive, and that's why I kinda get into, like with homeschooling and stuff like that, if you can kind of accommodate that personality, and people say, "Well, in the real world, they're gonna have to accept that." Well, no, not actually. An introverted person might go into the world and do something like work in a research lab where it's quiet and they just do research all day, and they don't have to really engage with people. No, it's you're not preparing anybody for a real world situation because a person who has their wits about them can go into the world and choose a path that that suits them. They can choose a path that kind of works with their personality. So I think it's kind of a lie to be like, "Well, we're preparing them for the real world." No, you're not actually preparing them for anything at all. That's kinda how I feel sometimes because just I see kids really struggling in this environment. It's just not good for them.
Yeah, I think it's, there's something to be said about just the system of schooling that we have globally as well. I mean, in most Western countries and aspiring Western countries like the one that I'm in, and it's the idea that you put together children of the same very narrow age cohort for a very long time, for a very long time every day, and for a very long time of their life. Not only what they teach them, but how they teach them. I mean, it feels like, there's a lot of low hanging fruit just in terms of minimizing, just mental trauma and things like that. Because some people, people who are extroverted and kind of confident, a minority of people do well in any environment. And, they kind of manage to wiggle out of the school system without having too many scars or, having, a lot of baggage. But I would say one in two people that I talk to about their life in schooling, and this, this U.S. people, people in England, and people in Romania as well, don't see it with very good eyes. They're either were struggling to keep up, or they were completely bored by the curriculum, and this is the good cases, or they had just absolutely crushing history of bullying, all sorts of just like traumatic events, either with the teaching staff or with other kids mostly, because yeah, it's absolutely feral what's going on. And what you describe is kind of an extreme situation, and it feels like this is ratcheted up to like a fever pitch. But yeah, I mean, this is fairly typical. I mean, are you aware of any more, I don't know, friendly, I mean, you mentioned homeschooling, but any other, forms of schooling, or maybe more experimental approaches to teaching children that may minimize some of of these
Yeah.
issues?
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, in my perfect world where everything is great, what I see as an ideal education avenue, like what would be ideal for most people is to, and there are a lot of schools that I know that are modeled this way. They're private or charter usually, but if you have like a hybrid approach where maybe you spend 2 or 3 days at school and then you have 2 or 3 days at home, just depending on how you stagger the week schedule. And it's a community involvement, it's a family involved thing where, maybe you go to school Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesdays and Thursdays, you're at home with mom and dad, and you're working on school stuff there, but it's kind of being overseen by your parents, so that parents are very much involved, engaged. Um, and that way, children who maybe do experience bullying, who are more introverted, that kind of thing, they have an opportunity for reprieve. They have those days at home where they can kind of breathe and have a break and recharge and that kind of thing. But again, that system couldn't work in America. I mean, it could, but it would be something that would, the whole culture would have to change, because our schools are designed for working parents. I mean, it's like a 7.5-ish hour day, and then longer if you have before school care or after school care, because you have so many parents who work. So having some sort of hybrid option is just not viable with the way things are in terms of people going to work. They don't have they can't have 2 days a week with their kids at home because they don't have anybody to kind of be there with them. So, um, that kind of environment would be ideal, in my opinion. And I just don't know how you get there. Again, you can pay for it here in the States, but it's not available to just anybody.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of, these experimental things, maybe just for now, like many other experimental things have been in the past, are just available to a select group of people who have the means, and especially the level of information to even know that this is out there,
Right.
and it's possible, and that it is good, and why it is good. Because yeah, like you said, most people just go on with their day, and maybe they kind of realize that the school system is, kind of a pit of feral dogs, but
Mhm.
they have no other options. And there's also the kind of the coordinating problem as well. Like, even if you were to pay for that, there's probably not that many schools. And yeah, they're tied into a very specific community. You'd probably have to move there. If you want to set up one of these schools yourself, that's a whole that's a whole can of
Mhm.
worms. You can't be
I've looked into
doing.
that. It's very expensive. It's very hard to
Yeah,
do. Yeah. Yeah, it's
I
hard.
can imagine. Yeah, I mean, if
Mhm.
it's like if you find a systemic problem with modernity and the societal decay, building your own institution from scratch, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do, and you probably need to
Yeah.
do it multiple times. Yeah, it's really really hard, and that's kind of what I find as well. Like even homeschooling here is a very rare thing, and it's usually tied to people coming from abroad or have like a very specific religious flavor to their lives, and there's not really like any homeschooling cooperatives which kind of might facilitate something in that vein. But here it's just like you could homeschool. You probably need to get my lawyer involved and get my child an exemption from the actual school system, and I probably could get that somehow, but it's not a direct line. It's not even like in the menu of options. You really have to order. You have to speak to the chef through
Right,
legal
right.
means, and then see if you can do that. And then, if you think homeschool children in the US are weird and freaky, imagine like the only homeschooled child in the whole city. So yeah, you'd be a total
Yeah,
freak.
like a yeah, yeah, I can imagine, yes.
Yeah,
Like,
so
"Oh,
it's
look, a homeschool family." It's like think of a wild animal, like, out in the out in the wild, like, "Oh my gosh, what's going on?" Yeah, it's funny.
yeah, and the thing is, like, I don't really see much else. I mean, the thing is the schools here are probably closer to what, like, the more the private school, probably closer to what you might have had in, like, I don't know, the 60s, 70s, or 80s in the US in some ways.
Mhm,
Less, sophisticated in some directions, but it doesn't really, you don't really get to the levels of, decay. But obviously you have the layer of technology on top, which is a very complicating factor, but, they're relatively more strict, some of them. Public schools can be quite quite feral themselves as well, but
mhm.
some of the more private schools, and when I say private school here, I mean, if you have a decent salary here, you can afford private school. It's not like, extremely, exotic type of good that you can only buy if you have a lot of money. There's a few private schools mixed in with state schools. It's the same thing that you have here with private hospitals. If you go private, I mean, most people go private because the state hospital is not a place you'd want to go. So that's, we kind of have that hybrid system here in Romania, and
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's kind of what works. But yeah, it's not terribly bad, but in itself, as a system, it still sucks terribly. Because I mean, I remember going through the system myself, and definitely hasn't gotten better since the last time I went through it. And yeah, it's just a lot of sitting, a lot of boredom, essentially being warehoused for decades. And luckily, what we had here is the Olympic system. I guess people have variants of this in other countries as well.
Mhm.
But what if you were interested in a very specific type of um, subject, and you wanted extra work in that direction, you just study for the Olympics, and then the teachers would actually pull you aside and give you kind of like a gifted program for that specific subject.
Mhm.
But outside of that, it was just a lot of sitting, a lot of boredom,
Yeah.
and yeah, and just constantly getting interrupted by kids who really didn't want to be there and maybe had
Yes.
some underlying behavioral problems, and was just can't constantly get into fights with the teachers. I mean, not physically, because the teachers here would literally just come and slap me across the face, and maybe do a little bit of light physical punishment back then. But yeah, I mean, people were very, it could take the whole hour for them to argue with teachers back then. So I guess it hasn't gotten much better since
Yeah.
then.
Yeah, and I wanna say too, like, about behaviors, I take behaviors really seriously. I mean, I don't want anybody endangered, I don't want students endangered, I don't want teachers endangered. I take behaviors very seriously. So I don't wanna sound like I'm minimizing them or being like, "Well, if we just teach them to read, they'll behave." No, I don't think that at all. I think the problem is so deep and wide that it really will take generations to change the culture that has produced this kind of student body, unfortunately. I mean, it just it's more than teaching reading, it's creating a culture where where families function as they're supposed to, where values are trickled down, where children are taught to behave and to engage with their community in a way that's productive and good and, virtuous. So, um, I don't take behaviors lightly. I mean, it's very serious. So I didn't wanna come across like, "Well, we just teach them to read." I wanted to say I take them very seriously, and, I just think that what it will take to fix things is just completely, like, an overhaul of a whole culture.
It is, and I think, you know, I speak to a lot of people on this podcast who've kind of taken the kind of every man for himself type view. Some people, trying to solve things at a systemic level, but like you can see probably on a daily basis, it's very hard. You don't even know where to begin, and it's kind of like one of those pillow principles. You push on one end, and the other thing pops up, and it's like
Right.
playing whack a mole with something that's just so vast and multifactorial
Mhm.
and it's, I feel like the most sound approaches are kind of local and, based on this community building and finding your people because essentially you're rebuilding society from scratch there because you really want people who echo your values. You want to kind of know who your children are spending time with, at least kind of vaguely know their parents and things like that. And yeah, I mean, this is indispensable, and this is something most people don't have anymore. And yeah, I feel like this is something that's really worth putting some elbow grease into. Even if you don't, build your own institutions, at least you can surround yourself with relatively sane people, and that will kind of do something in itself, and at least won't let your children go off the rails completely because after a certain point, you're not really your children's keeper. And that point is going down and down and down and down in terms of the age that the children have. And then if the peer group is, I don't know, anything like the children at your school seem to be, it's going to be tough to, I don't know, steer them into a very, positive or productive
Right.
direction.
No, that's right.
Yeah. But this is kind of a luxury solution to this stuff. It's not like a policy that you can just implement tomorrow and things would get better. I mean, it all starts with the parents. I mean, you've already
Mhm.
said this. It's
Mhm.
the parents need to be more interested in their children's future than they are in the minutia of their own lives and the little, I don't know. I know exactly what they're interested in, but they don't seem to be that interested in their kids.
Mhm.
I mean, as someone who's had some issues with social media, maybe not addiction, but a certain love for social media, especially Twitter, I can definitely see how this is could be a kind of a sneaking factor. And I also kind of noticed how other parents behave. I mean, you go to different playgrounds. There's like little soft play areas where my child goes around. I mean, he's so bouncy and wiggly that the idea of even pulling out my phone for maybe except for a photo, it's is not even a possibility. So that's
Mhm.
he keeps me in check just by being in constant danger. But other parents essentially just go to soft play thing and just leave their child to bounce around for hours, and then they're on their phone the whole time, and then they maybe lift their eyes for a second and see, is he still there? Okay, yeah, fine, not dead yet. So yeah, it's definitely prevalent. I don't know if it's like a hugely systemic thing, but it's definitely a lot of people are doing it. And I don't know exactly what they're doing on their phones, but they're definitely on their phones.
Yeah. You know, sadly, what I have seen are parents who are kind of involved in the same drama, online drama that their children are involved in. So, like, if a kid posts something on their social media, parents will come in and like argue in the comments, or they'll just recently one of my students was in a fight, and the reason she was in a fight is because someone else's mother messaged her during school and kind of got her agitated. So then it's like Jerry Springer. It's crazy. I don't know if you know who Jerry Springer is, but he's this really trashy like talk show. Okay. So that kind of thing happens. But also I was going to say about my students who use iPads for everything. I mean, they're every subject, every assignment, everything is done on an iPad. And that also has an effect on their literacy. Clearly, I'm like, let's talk about literacy all the time. But I just see it as being such a major issue. But whenever you read on a screen for a long period of time, and that's where you do most of your reading, you learn to read in an F pattern. So, like the natural reading is a Z pattern. So, if you and I read a page, it's a Z pattern. You read left to right, then back this way, and that's how your reading is. When you've read on a screen for a long period of time, you begin to read in an F. So, you read the top line, then you read a shorter line, then a shorter line, a shorter line, and you never actually read the entire page. You kind of have to train yourself to be conscientious of that so that you don't do that if you're reading a page on a screen. But, a 12-year-old's not going to be conscientious enough to say, "Oh, I'm actually not reading this whole thing." But that's one of the effects of reading on a screen all the time is that that develops, and so that's another factor in the literacy piece, the comprehension piece, is they're not actually reading the whole thing. So that's another piece of technology that I'm just like, X, don't like
Yeah.
that, kind of
That is
thing.
really interesting because I essentially yeah, bringing this back to my personal life. Obviously, I bought an iPad for instead of my e-reader, which is essentially kind of somewhere between a book and an iPad. But I did notice this, that I had a much more kind of laptop like experience or engagement with the iPad. And you know what the thing is? This whole F pattern thing. This is a principle of online marketing, of essentially, because that's kind of what I did in my previous life before I was a podcaster. Essentially, so-called conversion rate optimization and page layouts, and how do you create a website? And essentially, the F pattern is exactly how you want to lay out informational content of a website, above the fold, as they say, before you have to scroll. So that's at the top of a website. You have to kind of have the tagline at the top. It's like a title of an article, and then a little bit of information there. And it's just like you said, it just goes in short and short increments, because people, they just scan it like that from this corner, starting from this corner. And then by the time they get here, you can maybe make one or two extra little more points about the product, but that's about it. And if you fail to do this way, because people have been used to absorbing information this way, your website will fail. And that's why a lot of websites now, I mean, most websites look the same, because they all follow the F pattern. They all follow whatever other principles of conversion rate optimization, so that people actually, click on whatever you want them to click. But yeah, I mean, this stuff has a nature of its own, and everything's kind of converging to the same type of stuff, just because that's how people engage with it. But yeah, it's really strange. The medium is the message, and this is kind of what the mediums that we we have to engage with now. Yeah, so I also wanted to chat to you about maybe the more positive sides of social media, because I mean, obviously, myself, I've had a good experience, obviously a mixed experience with social media. It's not always been good, but I have this podcast because I've been on social media. I've met a lot of great people being on social media. I mean, what have you encountered? Kind of the silver lining of socials?
Yeah, I came to Twitter in 2020, no idea what Twitter was. I didn't even know what you did. I thought you got on there and, like, yelled at people about politics and stuff. I had no idea what Twitter was supposed to be. But over time, I still love politics, and I love that kind of stuff. I love cultural topics and things like that, but I slowly began to kind of gravitate toward kind of my people on there, which is what you do in real life. In real life, you gravitate towards your people. And so that's kind of what I did on Twitter. And Twitter has provided some great connections for me with my career, things that are of interest to me. I've met several people offline. I've connected with them on Twitter, met them offline, and it's been very enriching for me. And not because I want to live online, but it's nice to be able to connect with people that I wouldn't have been able to connect with otherwise. Those long range connections that didn't exist until social media, until these types of things. So the positive side, I've learned so much. I have learned so much being on Twitter. I think I have even developed a little bit more into who I actually am, because I've been able to connect with different interests and topics and people that have kind of helped me to develop as a person. I kind of know more about what I like, what I'm good at, that kind of thing, just through my Twitter engagement. It's also, in a strange way, made me, I think, a better writer, because I've learned to say things more succinctly. I've learned to kind of get to the point more. So in those ways, particularly Twitter, I'm not really active on any other social media platforms. I have an Instagram, but I'm not very active on there at all. Um, those are the positive things, in my opinion, of social media. And Twitter is different than the other platforms. Twitter is informational. It's where, and I'm not saying I'm an intellectual, but it is kind of where the intellectuals gather and they talk about ideas, and I really love that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely it for me as well. Obviously, like anything that is too good, it becomes, a bit, yeah, a bit obsessive after a
Mhm,
while. And there are
mhm,
certain dynamics in Twitter that I've kind of started noticing. It's maybe this has been going on since, the inception of the platform, but I feel like, you have certain communities and then they have a certain set of ideas that they debate. And I feel like the incentives of each of these communities is to be captured by people who hold the most extreme version of those ideas, because you can always
mhm, mhm.
gatekeep and say, "Oh no, you're not a true believer because the actual reality of this is that we need to, I don't know, exterminate X group, and
Right.
you're just someone who wants to deport them and something like that." And
Mhm, mhm,
there's all this type of gatekeeping, and yeah, I that's kind of, it feels to me like it's very hard to maintain nuance long term, and I feel like reality is a inevitably nuanced place. So I'm not, someone who thinks that, centrism is always at the middle of a spectrum. I think centrism is kind of a potpourri of different
mhm,
extremes, but it's not always the most extreme thing that we always have to gravitate towards. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm a traitor of whatever groups by just saying the idea that it might not be the wisest thing to always push things to the max, but it just feels like that's kind of the incentives. And I feel like a big problem that I see now is that a lot of the newer generation of people coming in to debate this stuff, because these are eternal issues. The nature of power, relations between men and women, how should political society be organized, what is sovereignty, what is the state, all sorts of super interesting questions.
mhm.
The thing is, these debates have been kind of raging for a while, and a lot
They're
of
not new.
they're not new. They're, yeah, thousands of years old, and that's why they're so interesting. But there are, people from maybe Gen Z and things like that coming in who have lived their lives in kind of a bubble of memes, and their only incentives are to essentially juggle memes. They haven't even had that minimal exposure to reality that millennials have had, or Gen X, or boomers, even maybe more so.
Mhm,
And they're essentially just dealing in meme magic. And now this kind of ratchet effect is at work in a lot of places. And yeah, obviously there are a growing cohort of people who really want to, I don't know, billions must die and stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, I've kind of been in these waters for a while, and I really came here for the fact that this is really an interesting place where things that were not discussed anywhere else were discussed. But now it's kind of, it's reduced in many ways to slogans, and slogans that are dumb in many ways as well.
mhm,
um which, slogans that kind of rhyme with the discussions that I came here to have, obviously, but that are not the same thing. And I feel like a lot of people don't see that. They're all talking about, yeah, friend enemy distinctions, and
mm, mhm.
yeah, all sorts of random stuff like that. And I don't know, it's just maybe for me, I've probably spent too much time in these waters. Need to take a break. But yeah, I feel like, something has been lost.
Yeah. You know, I've only been on there for, like, 2.5 years, so not a long time, so I don't have any I have no idea what it was like pre-2020. I didn't come until,
Yeah, me
like, the
neither. That's kind of when
I have no
I just
idea. Yeah. So I can't speak to anything before, but I can say, like, for me, and I'm just giving advice for anybody that wants to go to Twitter and, like, have a good Twitter experience. For me, it's been, like, what is my purpose here? Like, what do I want to do here? And I just have decided this is what I'm here to do. This is what I want to do. This is what brings me happiness, joy, whatever, to engage in these ways. I'm just going to block out what everybody else is doing. I don't care what they're LARPing or what they're doing. I don't care. Fine. If that's what they feel like they need to do here, that's fine. That's them. They're in their lane. I'm in mine. And I'm just there to talk about things that are interesting to me, things that I'm curious about, and to engage in discourse that elevates thinking. Um, I don't want to engage in debates. I don't want to argue with people. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I just want to engage about interesting topics and just be openly curious and let other people share things that they know that I don't know that maybe I can learn from. But I'm not there to do really anything else except that. I'm not trying to build anything. I just want to talk to people and engage with ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a healthy way of looking at that. I think myself have just been entangled in too many subcultures just because I've interviewed people from many
So
subcultures and
easy to do though in there. I mean, it's so easy to kind of get in with this group and then you say something one day. I mean, that's happened to me. You think you're in this group and then you say something that's like not on brand with that group and then it's suddenly you're an outcast. You're not part of them anymore. And it's very much like in a school setting like, oh, she's, she's not in our crowd anymore. It's very cliquish in that way. And so I think if you want to have a positive experience and not be kind of bogged down by those types of interactions, you just have to say, this is what they're doing, this is what I'm doing. I'm not worried about all that. If you're just an average person on Twitter.
yeah, and I think that's probably the most um kind of protective approach as well because a lot of these fads come and go. I see a lot of people kind of getting into trying to become queen bee of whatever subgroup at one point, and
Mhm, mhm.
because of the kind of the churning forces that are happening there, and without having to change your whatever political platform or whatever ideology you
Right.
have every 6 months, maybe even less now. You cannot maintain queen bee status. You'll have to flip flop continuously
That's right. Just be
yeah. So
you, just
I
do your thing and, like, not worry about anybody else. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess, if you're someone who, you know, believes in whatever audience they have, and there's kind of this phenomenon of audience capture as well, and you kind of try to, even without feeling it, you kind of slide in the direction of your audience. But I think a
Mm,
lot of people really lean into that because they know that there's power in having a big audience, and keeping them loyal and whatever, playing to their
right.
interest. Yeah, so
Yes.
yeah, I think there are many ways to play this game. I am not necessarily very good at this. Just, I just go on
I
there and
I
I'm like,
can't. I don't have the energy for it, man. I'm just like, I'm just gonna say the things I wanna say, but, like, I found myself kind of gravitating just in my own intellectual interests, gravitating toward a certain topic, idea, whatever. So I've been reading a lot about that lately and reading a lot of different authors and just kind of pondering and kind of trying to develop my thinking on a certain topic. And I've tweeted about it a little bit. And so now I'm getting, I guess, accused of being a certain thing or being a certain way, or people are starting to view me differently, which is fine. I really don't care. I'm I'm just trying to flesh out these ideas, and sometimes I'm putting my thoughts out there, and people engage with it, and that's great. I'm not trying to, I guess, be loyal to any certain thing. But I've gotten pushback sometimes for things that I've said, and I think people have started to categorize me in a certain way, and that's okay. I'm seriously just on there being curious, not trying to do anything.
yeah, I think also people that, insist on categorizing and excluding people, they're probably not necessarily the best, hangers on or friends that
Probably
you
not.
you want to
Yeah.
have. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's just the nature of social media. But yeah, enough of the shop talk. I want
Yes.
to
There we go. Sorry.
ask you the last question, the question of the show,
Yeah.
one
Mhm,
that
mhm,
everyone
mhm.
gets about the subversive
Yes, I'm
thinker
ready
that
for it.
is underrated, or whatever type of thinker you like. Good.
So I feel like there needs to be like a drum roll or something. I really have enjoyed Abigail Favale. She is someone I recently just read her book. I've listened to several interviews that she's done. She's kind of adjacent to the Louise Perry, Mary Harrington crowd. She has written a book called The Genesis of Gender, which I think is extremely relevant to this present cultural moment. She has like a pretty decent Twitter following. She's not super popular, but I feel like she is kind of underrated because I think she's so brilliant. And as a woman, I love what she is bringing to the fore in terms of thinking about gender dynamics, kind of how she stands up for women, and how she brings things. to our thinking that I think a lot of people don't consider when it comes to particularly femininity. In her book, one thing that she says that I absolutely loved was she talked about um, going into a women's locker room and just interacting with women of all ages and shapes and sizes and things like that, and how it was just such a different depiction than what we see like on social media and how images are curated, and how it was just such a great experience as a woman to see, oh, this is reality actually. You know, all these filtered and type images are is not reality. And she goes into just so much about gender, so much about femininity, and I think she is just incredibly brilliant. I have so much respect for her, and her book is great. And like I said, she's not quite as, I guess, maybe popular or whatever as Louise or Mary Harrington, but just as brilliant. So much to say. Highly recommend her book. Highly recommend following her. She's great.
No, excellent. I heard of Abigail before, and I've just kind of tangentially, but I haven't read her book yet. So yeah, that's a good recommendation. Also, the recommendation of going into women's locker rooms, if you are yourself a woman, obviously, and that is indeed an edifying experience. If you've only spent time on social media, even if it's at the equinox, you'd be surprised. Yeah, people come in different sizes, so
Yes,
it's
yes, yes. It was
yeah.
just, and that was just a, I mean, she didn't really talk about, like, physical, differences or anything. That was not, she didn't spend a whole lot of time. She went more of, like a philosophical approach, but it was such a beautiful thing. I almost cried. I was just like, this is what women need to hear, these types of things. They need to hear from other women and their experiences, and, um, not this fake curated stuff online. I love her. I think she's brilliant and highly recommend her.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree, and I feel like, just overhearing people speak in locker rooms and phone calls they're having or discussions they're having amongst
Right.
themselves. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I mean, it's just kind of a glimpse into like a mini society that, yeah, I think just people just don't have access to anymore. It's just a rare, very intimate. Unfortunate. I mean, I guess fortunately for the fact that you can experience it. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
So
This was
much. It was
really
such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.